to the What Really Happened radio show. Because World War III is a really bad idea. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It is Tuesday, April 16th, 2013. We're getting into the week here. Obviously, the Boston bombing continues to make the major headlines on the corporate news. We're going to be talking about that an awful lot today. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443, so you can call on in with your observations, theories, explanations about what's going on here. Manny is in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Now, earlier today, they had this big press conference with all of the various politicians and officials of Boston getting up there and talking about what's going on and congratulating each other for their heroic response to this horrible terror act. And of course, Obama got up there as well. And basically, they all said an infinite deal about absolutely nothing. There was very little hard information, and some of which is just outright lies. The latest spin we're getting from Boston is there were no unexploded bombs. There were only the two bombs used near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. Well, what about the one at the JFK Library? We saw the photos of the burn, the fire damage at the door. That was supposed to have been caused by a bomb. They have no leads. Right now, they've got nothing. And the entire press conference was about how they're activating all these agencies and all these emergency programs and then just calling out for tips. If you saw something, call and tell us. They don't really have a clue. Now, the only other hard piece of information to come out so far this morning is the nature of the bombs themselves. They were apparently inside pressure cookers. Somebody took some gunpowder, surrounded it with bits of metal. There were some ball bearings, nails with the heads removed, just general junk metal, and they put it together. They're now saying it was a timer, so there was no reason to shut off the cell phone system yesterday, and they had these pressure cooker bombs. So it's time to ban pressure cookers. We've got to stop this senseless killing. We need a 15-day waiting period for all cookware purchases. And we should allow no pressure cookers larger than a 1-quart size. And people on prescription antidepressants will have to be confined to cooking their dinners in the microwave oven only. So, let me see if I have this right. There's a greater than usual security presence at the Boston Marathon. People are commenting on it. The bomb squad is there with their dogs, and nobody, not Department of Homeland Security, not the Boston Police Department, not the FBI, nobody wonders why somebody's walking up and down the sidewalks with a pressure cooker. Maybe they thought it was just a large mariachi to make noise as the runners came by. But one thing that's probably going to come out of this is a push for taggants in gunpowder, which of course will mean registration of all bulk gunpowder purchases. That's one of the things they're probably going to be pushing for right now. A lot of people opposed to taggants in gunpowder because it impacts the smooth burning of the propellant, and of course those little tiny glass chips rapidly erode the interior of your gun barrel. But everybody's with an agenda to push is trying to use this for whatever their agenda happens to be. Now, interestingly enough, during one of the press conferences yesterday, where the Massachusetts governor was up there talking about this, one of the reporters in the audience asks if this marathon attack was a false flag staged to take away our civil liberties, promote homeland security, and the governor says no. Next question. Now, it sounds like a reasonable question to me, but let me ask you this, Mr. Governor. If you don't know who did it, how do you know it's not a false flag? Methinks the governor of Massachusetts doth protest way too much. So we're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back with more about the Boston bombing after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And I want to go back to yesterday when they were reporting they had a suspect at the Boston hospital, a Saudi man who was under guard. And then there was another photograph circulating of somebody who was actually on the ground in handcuffs. Those have gone away. Later in the day, the Boston Police Department issued a statement. They didn't have any suspects. And the story about the Saudi man illustrates how effective the Muslim bashing propaganda has been, because the only reason he was in the hospital and the police were looking after him was that he, like so many other people, was running away from the scene of the bombing. Somebody saw him and said, "Oh my goodness, it's a Saudi," and tackled him, knocked him onto the ground. And so they basically said he's got nothing to do with it, he's cooperating with the police and FBI, and he's no longer officially a suspect. The FBI has taken control of the investigation into the Boston bombings. They're up there posing and preening, and they're getting their camera time in the corporate media. And again, they're out there promising that there'll be justice, there'll be retribution, there'll be revenge. And they're following all these leads that are coming in, most of which, or so far all of which, are going nowhere. They've raided a couple of apartments. Turned out there was nothing there. They were looking for this Penske rental truck. That has panned out. They're just thrashing around here. And the big question, of course, remains, on the presumption that this is a false flag attack, who are they going to blame? And they're throwing the blame everywhere. Everybody's trying to use this to demonize whatever their target group is. Remember what Rahm Emanuel, former White House Chief of Staff, was saying is, you never let a serious crisis go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things you could not do before. Obviously, everybody's taking Rahm Emanuel's advice to heart. How can I use this to push whatever my particular agenda is? They're going to exploit this crisis. That's the reason for this constant coverage, to the exclusion of everything else. The only other non-bombing news I've seen on CNN so far today is to tell everybody that, hey, the stock market's back up and you're making money. Throw your money into the stock market. It'll be good for the country. So they were announcing that they were looking for a suspect who was a Saudi national on a student visa. Well, if they didn't know who he was, how did they know he was on a student visa? And so they're just throwing all of this stuff out there on who you should blame. And it's not just Saudis and Arab Muslims. And by the way, I got a lot of harassing and obscene emails saying, of course it was Arab Muslims. Of course it was the Muslims. Who else would do such a thing? Well, I have an easy answer for that one. CIA and Mossad, false flag attack. That's why that reporter was asking the governor that question. It's a reasonable question in this day and age. Is this another false flag attack to justify greater government control, surveillance, investigations, violation of the Bill of Rights? Of course it is. Apparently, the corporate media is out there, and let's see, the list of potential suspects is rapidly stretching to the entire country. Right-wing Christian conservatives are being blamed for this. A lot of, oh, it's all the right-wingers. It's those right-wingers, those GOP, whatnot. Chris Matthews is out there saying it's likely tax protesters who were behind this bombing, those evil people who just don't think they should be paying taxes just because it's unconstitutional. So they're blaming the tax protesters. And Eric Rush, who is associated with Fox News, on his Twitter account was out there saying that kill all the Muslims in the response to the Boston Marathon attack. Just presume they're all collectively guilty and start killing them. It's provoked a huge backlash against him. But everybody's using this to push their agenda. Now, there are some false flags, false trails, distractions. Apparently, one of the photos of the immediate aftermath of the bombing shows an individual up on the roof of one of the buildings overlooking the marathon route. And they're saying, who was he? Was he the perpetrator? Was he watching his handiwork from above? And if you look very carefully, from his particular location, he can't actually see either of the bombs. So I'm ready to rule him out as a perpetrator. Now, having been born in Boston myself and spent a great deal of time in that city, people go up on their roofs to get cool in the summer when it gets really humid, and it would make sense that anybody who's living or has an office in that building would go up to the top and look over to watch the marathon. It's a much less crowded venue, so I don't think that that's a particularly valid line of inquiry. So who is the enemy? Who's the villain? Why have they, remember 9/11, as soon as 9/11 was over, oh, it's Osama bin Laden. It had to be Osama bin Laden. They had the villain already picked out. This time they don't. Obama's up there saying, well, we don't know. We don't know if it was foreign. We don't know if it was domestic. They're hitting that domestic angle pretty hard. But, you know, the United States government has made so many enemies. 300 million Americans, 7 billion people around the world are all potential suspects in this thing. And maybe one possibility, if it's a false flag attack, they're not going to come up with a suspect or somebody they've arrested. And they'll say, ooh, demonize this person. The longer they go without having an actual suspect to arrest in this bombing, the more justification they have for aggressive investigation into the Occupy movement, patriot groups, anybody espousing violence, tax protesters, those pesky constitutionalists who want the government to play by the rule. This could be the beginning of a huge crackdown on dissent in this country under the guise of investigating the Boston bombing. We know that they're already trying to use the Boston bombing to ram the CISPA Act through Congress to tie together all these huge databases they're building on Americans, all of which failed to detect this bombing was going to happen. One little comment I noticed, looking at the overhead view of one of the bombing sites, remember all those large picture window storefronts along that sidewalk? There's one picture window where the glass from that window is blown out into the street, not in, which raises the possibility that the bomb was actually inside that storefront, could have been put there yesterday, Sunday, which means all this Boston police call for people to send in their photos and their videos from their cell phones and everything is a completely pointless waste of time. So everybody's out there short-stroking this thing, and already the corporate media is out there saying we have to be ready to give up more of our rights and civil protections in exchange for safety and security. They're out there pushing that whole thing. See, we've got to do more of what we're doing. Peter King is already out there saying, obviously with the Boston bombing, we can't cut funding for Homeland Security or our police department. So, hey, there's a motive right there. Maybe the Department of Homeland Security set off this bomb. They're in the middle of building a $3.9 billion headquarters. They've been spending money with wild, reckless abandon on ammunition and explosives. They got to be running out of cash right now. They've got a good motive right there. But everybody's screaming, we need more security. We've got to grope your crotches at the bus stations and the train depots and all the rest of it. Now, at this point in the Boston bombing story, there are really only two possibilities. The first possibility, and the most likely one in my mind, is this was a false flag attack staged by either the U.S. government or Israel or both to serve an as-yet undisclosed political agenda, or it was a genuine act of terror. And if it was a genuine act of terror, what it tells us is that the Department of Homeland Security, the Transportation Safety Administration, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, the fusion centers are all a complete waste of taxpayer money. All these databases, all the warrantless scanning of our emails, social media, listening to our phone calls, all the crotch-grabbing, surveillance cameras, microphones, GPS tracking, naked scanners were totally and completely useless. Even the bomb-sniffing dogs on site in Boston, supposedly for a training drill, failed to sniff the bombs. From top to bottom, the entire security industrial complex laid a big, fat egg on this one. They failed, they failed, they failed. Simply, completely, and utterly. And therefore, there is no more justification for the people of the United States to put up with this erosion of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Simply on the basis of complete epic fail and incompetence, all of these agencies ought to be shut down. And let's spend the money on improving our roads, schools, and hospitals. This security industrial complex is a complete failure. The Boston bombing proves it. We were told we had to put up with naked scanners and listening to our phone calls and reading our emails in order to prevent terrorism. Well, guess what? It didn't work. And doing more of it is not going to help the situation. It's time to rethink the terror threat. You want to end terrorism? I know how to end terrorism overnight. Stop messing around with other people's countries. That's how you stop terrorism. Homeland Security is a huge, gigantic waste of money. Homeland Security spent money on things like seminars, on, like, did Jesus die for Klingons too? Trainings for the zombie apocalypse. It's just a huge cash cow for all those people inside DHS to live high on the taxpayer hog and travel the world for all these conferences and seminars and just live the life of luxury at the expense of the American people. And the one thing they were supposed to do, prevent an act of terror, they failed to do. They're a complete failure. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, over the last several months, I have been commenting on the surveillance state here in the United States of America. Reading the emails, your random DHS monitored phrase of the day, this idea that they're keeping records of what you buy through your shopping cards and credit cards. They're scanning Facebook and Twitter for your conversations, your network of friends. And I have stated many times, this is a gigantic bluff on the part of the government to scare you into being silent, to scare you into being isolated from your fellow American, to scare you into going back and being dependent on the corporate-owned and government-controlled media for whatever it is you're supposed to believe today. And I stated many times that the sheer volume of data that these entities and organizations are collecting at huge taxpayer expense, I might add, would be impossible to actually derive any valid intelligence from. First of all, if they're going out to social media to collect information on Americans, people lie on Facebook. That's just especially if they're single, looking for somebody. They're going to greatly overinflate who they are, how much money they have, how young they are, how beautiful they are. It's an unreliable source of intelligence. And just the sheer volume of information they're collecting on all Americans is so huge. Correlating that information becomes virtually impossible because the collection of information on Americans is a linearly additive process. But the correlation of all that data is an unlimited expansion. The lines of possible connection and communication are expanding as a power function of the total amount of data collected. And I've been saying all along, it will be impossible to derive anything meaningful from all of this data they have been saving. And we pointed out this ridiculous situation where one of these fusion centers sicked a SWAT drug raid on a home because they had bought indoor gardening supplies, and it turned out they were growing a vegetable garden to supplement their food budget. And the SWAT team kicked down the door and terrorized the family, and they were looking for people growing that dreaded marijuana plant. And they found absolutely nothing. It doesn't work. It's just there to scare you into silence, to make sure you're not sharing with your friends and family in your email your concerns about the disastrous course this nation is on. And of course, yesterday's Boston bombing underscores that. They're saying right now, no early indications, there was absolutely nothing on the screen, there was no terrorist chatter. Now they're saying that they don't think there's a link to Al-Qaeda, so obviously they're going to say this is a domestic terrorist threat. It's a repeat of the Oklahoma bombing. Oh, we've got to crack down on all those people who don't love their government. And it just hammers home the point that all of this data they're collecting on you is useless. It's a waste of taxpayer money. The one thing we were constantly told about all the surveillance cameras and GPS this and cell phones listening to the room on the microphone was it was there to prevent acts of terror. Guess what? It doesn't work. You want to start talking about where you should be doing the budget cuts to cure the deficit? Let's shut down this security industrial complex. It's a complete failure, unless you are Michael Chertoff and one of his investors, and of course they're rolling in the dough right now. But this sheer volume of unreliable data they've collected on all Americans is completely and utterly useless for its espoused purpose of preventing acts of terror. Because they're admitting they had absolutely no idea this was going to happen. Unless, of course, you look at this issue about the bomb-sniffing dogs and spotters up on the roofs, and this idea they were saying, oh, there's a drill, pay no attention, there's a drill going on here today. They kept, we're getting these witnesses coming forward saying that all of these bomb squad people were saying it's just a training exercise. Shades of 9/11 and the 7/7 London bombing, which took place in the middle of ongoing drills that simulated exactly what wound up really happening. Kind of a little Vuja day there. They now have 400 Massachusetts National Guardsmen on duty. They had them on duty during the marathon. That was a big help, wasn't it? Now, the metropolitan Boston region has, like most major American cities, a network of police surveillance cameras. They didn't see anything. They haven't found anything. They've been going back through all the tapes and scans and whatnot. They're not able to identify anything that's another total waste of taxpayer money that did not prevent the bombing. Over in Great Britain, where London has the highest density of these security cameras of any city on planet Earth, they finally figured out it's not deterring crime. It's just there to remind you, you are being watched by the government. You'd better not do anything we don't want you to do. Going to take a break for commercials. We will be right back. And aloha, welcome back to the show. And we're getting word from over at TaxProf blog that Obama is now starting to adopt the position that the Boston bombings were linked to tax day. It was a tax protest. Gosh darn those people who think the income tax is unconstitutional. They're resorting to violence, and of course not. People who are anti-tax, when they go violent, they tend to target the IRS. Like that guy in Austin, Texas, a few years back who crashed his plane into the IRS office, and it turned out afterwards that he had been right and the IRS had been wrong. The Boston Marathon was chosen because with all the TV cameras gathered there at the finish line, it guaranteed maximum public media coverage. It was chosen for its media value, which tells us this is a PR stunt. It's one of the many reasons why I think it was, in fact, a false flag attack. Now, a little bit of a flashback. This is from the Daily Mail. Government spy program will monitor every phone call, text, and email. Details will be kept for up to a year. We have been hearing this stuff for year after year after year. We're recording everything. We're saving everything to protect you from terrorist attacks. It does not work. It is a huge expense. And it does not work. Complete waste of money. All that we have been asked to endure, TSA grabbing our crotches, exposing us to these machines which are now known to cause skin cancer, those terahertz radio wave machines, just like the X-rays, damage your DNA. That's now established. Janet Napolitano refused to go through one in a demonstration in front of the media. And of course, our political leadership are exempt from TSA groping and grabbing. Corporate leadership, because they have their own private jets that go out of the corporate terminals, don't have to go through that, but you do. It's the security industrial complex. It's reaping huge, huge amounts of money off the peddling of fear. And none of it really works. It did not work in Boston yesterday. And these people who are out there screaming for more funding and more intrusion, they're just after your money. They know it will not work. It's just all about the money. It's all about taking more of your money under false pretenses. Now, all across America, everybody is ramping up their security. Cleveland, the police are increasing their patrols after the Boston Marathon bombings. There's an interesting quote out of this story, and this came out of WKYC. Quote, the Division and the Fusion Center remain in close contact with law enforcement entities along the eastern seaboard. At this time, there are no credible threats to our area. Well, that's what the Fusion Centers were saying yesterday morning. Down here from Fox8Live.com, Louisiana State Police monitors security situation in Boston. Colonel Mike Edmondson said Monday afternoon that the Louisiana monitoring takes place at the Fusion Center at State Police Headquarters. That's an around-the-clock operation that works to identify threats of violence or terrorism. Obviously, failed to do that in Boston. The Cincinnati fire officials are saying they're ready for their marathon, the Flying Pig Marathon. They're fully prepared for the worst. And it's a reminder that all of these uniformed people, and I don't mean to slam the fire department and the first responders, who are dealing wonderfully well with the situation, but it goes right back to that same argument I made about the gun grabbers. The police are never there to thwart the crime. The FBI is never there to thwart terrorism. That's why they're having to fake all these, with the entrapment, where they'll set up their own terror plot, they'll recruit somebody into it, and then arrest the recruits and hold them up to the media. And then the judge throws it out because it is entrapment. Now, along with all the ammunition the Department of Homeland Security has been buying, a couple of years back, they purchased 700 pounds of high-density ammonium nitrate and 700 pounds of RDX, a high-velocity explosive, ostensibly to train their bomb-sniffing dogs with. That's a lot of explosives to train their dogs with. And apparently those dogs didn't do very well in Boston either. Now, a lot of people are looking at what happened in Boston, and they're looking back at very obvious prior instances of false flag terror. And a lot of people are looking back now at the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, where it came out after the fact that the FBI had infiltrated this terror group. And the FBI informant inside this group requested FBI permission to swap the real explosive powder for a harmless substitute, and the FBI told him no. Leave it the way it is. This was reported in the New York Times. And the FBI's excuse was, well, we thought we had better ways to use this individual. So we know, going all the way back to COINTELPRO, that the FBI will cause crimes to be committed for the publicity value, for the political value. Remember when it came out that the Federal Emergency Management Agency was in New York the night before 9/11? This was when Dan Rather interviewed FEMA spokesman Tom Kenny, who admitted on TV FEMA had been pre-positioned the night before 9/11, ready to go into action, which stands as a very sharp contrast to FEMA's reaction to Hurricane Katrina, where it took them a week to show up. Remember the London bombings, and it came out the Mossad had known about that ahead of time? They were claiming, oh, it was only 6 minutes before it actually happened. Well, 6 minutes is very telling. You knew it was going to happen before it happened. Remember those London 7/7 bombings? They were holding a terrorist training drill to drill for bombing of the underground. And we got emails from people in London saying that the week before, somebody was going through the Muslim neighborhoods hiring Muslims to play at terrorists for this security drill, who may have gotten on those trains not knowing the practice bombs they were carrying weren't practice bombs, because these weren't men that you would normally associate with suicide bombing. One of them had a brand new baby. Probably took the job because he needed money. Brand new father. People like that don't do suicide bombings. Remember the attack on the USS Liberty? Blame Israel for that one. Remember the Lavon affair? Blame Egypt for that one as well. I'm sorry. USS Liberty was blamed on Egypt, carried out by Israel. All right, we got a caller on the line. Tom in Texas. Aloha, Tom. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Brother Mike. As always, thank you for your time. I hope they don't try to blame this on like domestic terrorists, because I have a great example for a domestic terrorist for you.
Yes.
remember the guy that flew his airplane into the IRS building?
Yes.
Okay. He didn't target a high school parade or an elementary school, did he?
No, he didn't.
Yeah. So
He targeted the villain in his life, and as I mentioned earlier in the show, when all the shouting was over, it turned out he was right. The IRS had cheated him and refused to make good on their own mistake, and they took his business and they took his home, and they basically left him with no other option.
So you know exactly what I'm speaking of. That's
Yes.
wonderful.
Yes.
Now, I've been meaning to tell you, remember you did your piece on Bankers Wars?
Yes.
In my opinion, that was absolute genius.
Thank you.
Now, I'll do a good old Texas boy hand, I guess it'd have to be virtual handshake with you. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I will send you a pre-1962 dime if you'll put the same passion and the same research into this carbon tax.
Well, I've been pounding on the carbon tax good and hard, and if you look...
You haven't, I'm sorry I interrupted, but you haven't done a prolonged presentation. And you're the man, I think, that can wake everybody up to what such a ripoff that we have to pay to breathe.
Well, I'll reprise it. We have covered this at length, but I will reprise it because Obama is talking about a new carbon tax.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, we give out carbon dioxide, plants suck it up and give out oxygen. Okay, so they're going to take all this money and plant a new rainforest?
They're going to take all this money and they're going to spend it on the same thing they've spent all the other money on, bailing out Wall Street, paying for the wars, funding to Israel. It's already been shown that all of this carbon credit nonsense in Europe has not actually impacted carbon dioxide levels. Carbon dioxide levels continue to go up while the world gets cooler, which basically underscores that this was all just another gigantic fraud.
Well, I would have greatly appreciated if you'll tell me and everybody else why it's going to cost us to breathe.
That's exactly what it is. And I'll tell you what, after the radio show today, I will reprise my main ClimateGate article to the front page of whatreallyhappened.com so you can come in and take a look at the coverage we have given it, because we have, in fact, spent a great deal of focus on it.
Okay, if you'll hook me back up with your control guy, I would like to get an address. I'm going to send you a dime.
Well, you can get that by going to the little donate item on my webpage, and there's a postal box address that you can use.
Right on, man. Okay, that'll work.
All right, thank you an awful lot. And I've got silver now. I've got silver. Huzzah, huzzah. All right. Now, getting back to the corporate media, they're doing a full court press to make sure every American knows what a horrible tragedy this was, and it was, up in Boston. And they're down to interviewing all the friends of the victims, and especially they're waving this 8-year-old boy around who got killed in the explosion. And it is a horrible tragedy. And they're interviewing the neighbors, and oh, he was such a good little boy, and they're laying the schmaltz on with a trowel on this. They're going for the tear-jerker. Oh, how horrible. How horrible. And it was horrible, don't get me wrong. Boston is my birthplace. I have friends and family still there who thankfully are safe. They were not caught in this whole thing. And we do extend our sympathy and condolences to the victims of this terrible act, regardless of who's behind it. But Boston now knows what an Obama drone strike feels like. Because every time Obama sends one of these drones into countries that we may not even be at war at, and they attack a terror suspect, meaning somebody who has not actually had his day in court, for whom there may not be evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, and they blow the suspect up. An average of 50 innocent bystanders are killed with every one of these drone strikes. And it's rather amazing to see the American corporate media look at these drone strikes as, well, hey, no big deal. And then the bombing in Boston, they're playing it for all the sympathy they can get. If it's wrong to blow up innocent people in Boston, and it is, it's wrong to blow up innocent people in Yemen or Pakistan or any of these other countries. Right and wrong does not stop at the border of the United States of America. Now, speaking of the drone strikes, the House panel has now decided they're going to subpoena the Department of Justice for all the memos related to Obama's drone strike policy. Remember, up until now, it's a big black box. Oh, we know this person deserves to be killed. We're going to go kill them. You don't need to know why. And the House Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte, Republican from Virginia, is announcing he is subpoenaing the memos detailing the legal structure behind Obama's ability to simply kill people wherever he feels like it. Now, we know the White House is going to dig in their heels, and so is the Department of Justice, because under the Constitution, there is, in fact, no legal framework for the president to just haul off and kill people at will. So there will be a huge fight over that, and they'll cite national security, we can't weaken our resources, you know, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, as tragic and horrible as the Boston bombing is, and it is, now they have learned firsthand what all these other countries are experiencing from these American drone strikes. You're out there on the street, there's a parade, or there's a marathon, or you're just down in your village market square, and you're buying food for lunch and dinner, and all of a sudden, with no warning, there's a horrendous explosion. And people that you have known all your life, you've grown up with, friends and family, are lying about you in bloody shreds. And it doesn't matter if it's a pressure cooker bomb. Doesn't matter if it's somebody in a suicide vest. Doesn't matter that it's a multi-million-dollar robot overhead. It is still an act of terror. And if it is wrong to have it happen in Boston, it is wrong to have it happen in Yemen or Pakistan or Iran or Iraq or any of these other places. These robotic killing machines are being deployed. Now, as I mentioned before, we're looking at the complete and utter failure of the security industrial complex. And over at stratrisks.com, they've come up with a new phrase, the enemy industrial complex. The need of the U.S. government, who is now mirroring the same policy as the Israeli government, to constantly create enemies. So the people feel under threat and will go along with any agenda whatsoever. Please save me from the big bad whatever, Mr. Government person. And for that very reason, it is the government that has the strongest motive of all to carry out these terror attacks as a false flag and blame somebody for it. Remember Oklahoma City? We're coming up on the anniversary of that. And we know that was very suspicious. What was it used for? Oh, we've got to have these domestic terror laws. We've got to suspend civil rights in certain things. We've got to have more legal weapons to use against these dissenters and these people who don't like the direction the country is going in. And they're going to use that. They're going to use the Boston bombing for the same thing, to push that agenda forward. And as I said, one of the reasons they don't have an automatic immediate villain that they're going to arrest and parade before the world is they may use this Boston bombing as a justification for an enhanced, aggressive investigation into anybody that doesn't agree with private central banking or the actions of the federal government or the war policy. So this may be the beginning of a real crackdown under the guise of finding the Boston bomber. And by the way, the corporate media is now out there saying that, yes, this Saudi who was injured in the hospital is not a suspect. They don't have a suspect. We think it's one of you, 300 million Americans, and we're going to investigate each and every one of you until you love your government again. So, we're coming up on another commercial break here. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, the corporate media is already out there proclaiming that there is no evidence that Al-Qaeda had anything to do with the Boston bombing. And I can understand why they're going to basically say that, because up until now, the United States government has been justifying their drone strikes and intrusions into these other countries with the idea that there's a war against Al-Qaeda, even though the U.S. is giving Al-Qaeda money and guns in Syria to overthrow Assad. So the public perception is we're willing to put up with all this expensive war and all this intrusion and security because we've got to defeat Al-Qaeda, and the U.S. government has recently been saying, yes, we've smashed Al-Qaeda, there's only a few fringe elements left. So they can't turn around and say Al-Qaeda has attacked the United States again, or it makes everything they've done since 9/11 look like a joke. And there's a very interesting story that came out regarding the director of U.S. National Intelligence, James Clapper. He was in a congressional hearing last Thursday was quoted in the Los Angeles Times, basically saying the new threat is domestic extremism. The lone wolves, the domestic extremists, and jihad-inspired groups are still determined to attack us. So we're beginning to see the agenda of the Boston bombing. A crackdown on domestic terrorists and extremists. So that is basically what they're pushing with this. We're going to go to the phones. Gloria in Indiana. Aloha, Gloria. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Glad to talk to you. I, over the years, have been putting together all of these dates, and if you don't mind, I'd like to read them to you.
Okay, we've got 3 minutes in this segment.
Okay, it's not long. Waco was in April 19th of 93.
Mm-hmm.
Oklahoma City, April 19th, 95.
Mm-hmm.
You have Columbine, April 20th, 1999. Virginia Tech, April 16th of 2007.
Mm-hmm.
British Petroleum Oil spill, April 20th.
That one, I think, was just a coincidence.
Maybe.
Yes.
Hitler's birthday, April 20th, 1889. And also Holocaust Remembrance Day is supposed to be April 21st. I just think that, you know, when we talk about the government doing all these inside jobs, I don't know, they worship they worship the devil or something.
I'll tell you what it is, and some of those items don't need to be on that list. The reason for the focus on April 19th is that's the anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, which is where the British government attempted to seize the weapons of the American colonists, and it didn't work out very well for the British forces. So that is the traditional Patriots' Day for those in the Patriot movement. Now, for some reason, Massachusetts has changed Patriots' Day to be the 15th. So, in point of fact, the Boston bombing did take place on Patriots' Day as it's commemorated in Massachusetts. The Waco final takedown was on Patriots' Day, and supposedly the motivation for Timothy McVeigh to blow up the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma on the 19th was to commemorate the final immolation of that church in Texas, and, of course, to coincide with the battles of Lexington and Concord. Some of those others on the list, I'm not too sure about. We got to take a break for station identification. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And the corporate media is still waving those bloody shirts as hard as they can from Boston. And they're going through the family trees. Oh, this runner's mother was injured, and this person's first cousin's lawyer's chiropodist accountant's secretary was injured, and they're just going on and on and on about this whole thing. So there's definitely an agenda at work. They're trying to rub all of America's nose in the bloody sidewalks of Boston right now, and there's got to be a reason. And remember back when I said the FBI is often creating the very cases or the very situations that are cited as political justification for further erosion of our civil rights. And there's a reminder, you know, we've heard the white supremacists are being demonized and they're racist and they're all the rest of that stuff. And it's part of that whole divide and conquer to keep the blacks and the whites angry with each other, to keep the men and women angry with each other, to keep us divided against each other so we don't unite as one American people and look at the real source of all of our problems, which is private central banking and a complicit federal government. And just a reminder, remember Hal Turner, who was out there on the radio and he was just saying all of these very provocative things and screaming at people, and he was often cited by the corporate media as a reason why there had to be controls on the content on the internet and the blogs. And it turned out, of course, he was an FBI informant. His code name was Valhalla. And he was out there basically putting out into the alternative media what the FBI wanted to be there in order to attack the alternative media. Going to go to the phones. Ben in Chicago. Aloha, Ben. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, appreciate it, Michael. Aloha. And, hey, love the show, man. Just started listening to you about a year ago, and probably my favorite talk radio all day long. But, hey, you know, you just had a caller mention the significance of April 15th, and one of the biggest significances that I haven't really heard talked about is the fact that it's Israel's Independence Day, April 15th.
Yes.
So I thought that was a pretty interesting coincidence. But I think it's pretty early to talk about whether or not this is a false flag. I hear a lot of people talking about whether they're of that opinion. You mentioned some of the previous precedents that the FBI has set with some of these provocatory events. One of which, I mean, I'm in Chicago. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. There was a big one in Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm not sure if you recall about these 5 kids that they arrested that were plotting to bomb a bridge in Cleveland, and that proved to be false and actually proved to be, kind of spearheaded by one of the FBI informants who was subsequently arrested.
Very much
so.
So
Definitely skeptical of what's going on in Boston. You mentioned the JFK fire. Not sure how that's related. If it is related, in fact, it would be one hell of a coincidence if it isn't. But I'm trying to, bide my time, play this one close to the vest before I make any determination about what I think is going on. But one of the things that was encouraging to me was yesterday they didn't have, as you would put it, some kind of patsy or some initial suspect that they rolled out. We talked about the Saudi national kid. It seems like they're backing off him as a suspect. That would have concerned me a lot more if they had a suspect ready to roll out. I would have been a lot more suspicious. So that being said, maybe this is an organic act of terror. Who knows? But we just want to get that out there. I mentioned the April 15th. Keep rocking on, Michael. Appreciate the show, man.
All right, thanks an awful lot. I think the fact that they do not have a ready suspect or villain to throw at us is actually more alarming because, again, it looks to me like they're going to use this Boston bombing to justify a crackdown on all dissident groups, independent media, anybody who doesn't like private central banking or the actions of the federal government and the disastrous course this nation is on, and it is on a disastrous course. They're trying to do the gun grab. There's too many people standing up and opposing the gun grab. So this could be the beginning of the federal government saying, we must enforce the law on blah, blah, blah. And then they invent a whole new bunch of laws like CISPA to basically go on out and try and silence all dissent for this rush toward whatever it is they think they're doing with the New World Order. We got to take a break for commercials. Back with more phone calls after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And the corporate media is now reporting officially the Saudi gentleman who is injured, was in the hospital, is not a suspect. The only reason he was a suspect is he was seen running from the scene of the bombing. You know, when bombs go off, people tend to run. And many, many years ago when I was down in Australia, I witnessed a terror bombing. And guess what? People were running away. Didn't mean they were guilty. Going to go back to the phones. Peter in Los Angeles. Aloha, Peter. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, a couple things, Michael, but go on with your suspect thing. If we went by our drone strike criteria, if you were a male between 15 and 45, then, you're a suspect. So, but at any rate...
well, thank goodness I'm safe.
Yeah. But you remember that earlier caller, I largely agree with. I'm not completely sold on this. I largely agree with you that this probably is a false flag, but I'm starting to grade them now as to the learning curve the government has, because I suspect that it probably is. And one of the things that you correctly pointed out is, for once, they didn't roll out the Oswald or the Timothy McVeigh, which they caught it a couple hours later, or the guy at the Times Square bombing or whatever. And then they haven't so far had the people calling in and saying they had previous notice, like Odigo or the London bombing with Mossad, and I think Madrid also had a Mossad pre-warning. So they seem to learn on that one. However, the politicians simply can't get it out. They can't be seen looking like they're sitting on their hands. So they have to have, like, the FEMA still there. In this case, they have to have the dogs and the bomb squads there ahead of time, and they have to have their exercises, right? Mm-hmm. The exercises that always accompanies this thing, like the exercise they had at 911 for a building, a plane hitting a building.
Yes.
This time they had one for bombing, which, of course, enables them to react faster and not look like the incompetent boobs that they are.
Correct.
They can't. They just can't get away from the exercise thing. That's something that they won't compromise on. But I would give them a grade of like a B- at this false flag. They've corrected a lot of their past mistakes, and they're getting much better at it.
Well, the problem is the public is getting much more skeptical, and I want to be very clear here. It is my presumption that this is another false flag attack, And should evidence surface to the contrary, I'm willing to revise that position. But given all the false flags that we have seen, given the media saturation to try and exploit this horrible tragedy as much as possible, it does feel like a false flag. And I think the absence of a Lee Oswald or an Osama bin Laden is because this attack is going to be used to justify greater federal police powers, to ram CISPA through, to say we've got to watch more, we've got to read more of their email, we've got to listen to all their phone calls, all of which provably did not work yesterday, but they're out there pushing more of the same thing at hideous taxpayer expense.
Well, didn't this also coincide with some votes on the gun bill in Congress?
Yes, it does, but there are no guns involved in this situation. There's no assault rifles.
Oh, I understand.
You know,
what they can do, Mike, is they can say, well, we're pursuing Lee's, and it looks like a white supremacist, anti-government, whatever, you know, and that's exactly what they're going to do.
Yeah, I'm expecting they're going to do that. Even if it is a genuine organic terrorist attack, they're still going to exploit it for whatever their political gain they can get out of that situation. And right now, the only venue for the gun grabbers to get on board this particular wagon is to call for taggants added to gunpowder, which would then require all purchases of bulk gunpowder to be registered. Right.
Well, and not to get too far afield, but you mentioned the hundreds or thousands of pounds, I can't remember the quantity, but it was enormous, that Homeland Security had
700 pounds of high-density ANFO and 700 pounds of RDX.
And that goes along with the further 20,000 M16s, which were stolen in Kuwait last week. Did you read that? I think I read it on your blog.
Yes, we reported on that. Unguarded warehouse. 20,000 M16s, full auto military weapons, just vanished.
Anyone want to make a bet that they end up in Syria or Libya or Mali or you know, somewhere like that?
I would say probably most of them are on their way to Syria right now.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Mike. Anyways, just wanted to go ahead but if it is a false flag, my point is they're getting better at it. They didn't make some of the really obvious mistakes, but there's some that they always make, and they always will.
Well, I think all these false flags were a mistake because, again, we're dealing with a very skeptical public who's not willing to believe these official stories at face value any longer, and so they may be correcting their past mistakes, but it's too late.
I know. I agree.
Okay?
All right, Guy.
All righty. Now then, over at activistpost.com, they're reporting that 34 civil liberties organizations are opposing CISPA following the markup that was done last week behind closed doors. Apparently the new version of the bill is now out there for public review, and it basically erased all possible privacy protections for the American people. What CISPA is going to do under the guise of cybersecurity is basically make everything that you do on your computer, online, social media, smartphone, open to government surveillance without warrants, without restrictions, and without regard to where the data is sent for what purposes. It's basically like telling the police, you know, here's a key to my house, I trust you not to do anything wrong when you're inside my home. And it's a complete violation of the Fourth Amendment. And no doubt they're going to use this Boston bombing to try and ram that through Congress, saying we need more surveillance. No, we don't. You got all the surveillance already. And it didn't work because the volume of data they're collecting on the American people is so vast, it is impossible to correlate the information to yield a meaningful result. Boston proved that. It's a complete, utter failure. And here they are pushing for more of it. Peter King's out there saying, we've got to make sure that Homeland Security and the police have got more money. Why? They're wasting the money they got now. It's a complete waste of money. All of these intelligence agencies. We have 16 intelligence agencies. One ought to be enough. It's all egos and turf war and money out there. Meanwhile, getting back to the gun grabbers, one story that came through, apparently down in Virginia, a psychiatrist has gone public that he gets a $3,000 bonus for every veteran he is able to declare mentally unfit to keep and bear arms. So they're literally paying money to disqualify returning veterans from owning guns. That's how desperate they're getting. Why are they targeting veterans? Well, because in the event of a confrontation between the federal government and the 50 states, those veterans are the most highly trained and combat-ready segment of the population. So they're out to take the guns away from the veterans. What a slap in the face for all these kids who put on that uniform and went out and fought the bankers' wars, did as they were told, and they come back home and the first thing the government says is, we don't trust you with your guns any longer. And they're out there literally paying bounties to psychiatrists to say, oh, this veteran, he's suffering post-traumatic stress disorder and he's addicted to SSRIs and therefore he can't be allowed to have his guns. The gun grab is definitely on. All right, I want to talk about some other things here. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. And by the way, for that caller who called in earlier about ClimateGate and carbon taxes, I have reprised my main article on that subject to the front page of WhartWillyHoffman.com, so you can go take a look at that. And we have covered it in intense depth, what a fraud that is. Now, getting over to North Korea. Remember, end of last week, John Kerry was heading over to the Koreas to defuse the situation and get everybody to talk peace. Well, apparently somebody has decided going forward with an attack on North Korea is back on the policy table, because now John Kerry is pulling back and saying, well, you know, it's pointless to have artificial talks with North Korea. We can't take anything they say at face value. And so now they're backing away from making peace, and it looks like they're trying to gin up some way to go to war with North Korea. Who knows? Maybe they'll blame the Boston bombing on North Korea. It wasn't a pressure cooker, it was a kimchi pot. And they'll be off and running with that whole thing. North Korea's government, of course, is vowing that unless South Korea ceases its anti-North activities, which includes all of these military drills, that North Korea reserves the right to retaliate. Now, I'm sure all of us would like to like North Korea to tone down some of the rhetoric, but on careful examination of what they're saying, they're not saying anything that is unreasonable. They are feeling very threatened by the U.S. military presence. They're feeling very threatened by U.S. nuclear weapons. They're feeling very threatened by these military drills between South Korea, Japan, and the United States just off their shores, practicing for what is clearly an invasion. And so it's reasonable for North Korea to say, if you attack us, we will attack you back. That's what deterrence is supposed to be about. And, of course, the U.S. is back to screaming about, oh, North Korea, they've learned how to miniaturize their nuclear weapons. Nuclear threat, nuclear threat, nuclear threat. So they're thrashing around on that one. Meanwhile, over in Syria, Assad's forces have succeeded in breaking through the rebel blockade of a couple of key military bases. And this is now opening the way for renewed supply lines and possibly the ground for a new campaign to recapture territory lost to the hired mercenaries. So the war in Syria isn't going very well at all. We'll be back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And over at From the Trenches World Report, we're getting a story, and a lot of other people are also noticing this. The media is now starting this constant drumbeat of the patriots are responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing. Oh, gosh darn, those people who disagree with the government, they're resorting to violence. And, of course, that's completely absurd. It's completely nonsense. Any group within a country that is seeking to change the system needs popular support. They are not going to carry out actions that destroy public sympathy for their cause. When Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were out there trying to kick out the British government, and more to the point, the Bank of England, they didn't go into colonial schools and start killing children. They didn't start burning American villages. That would have been counterproductive. They needed the support of the American people to lead to the War of Independence. And the same is true today. The patriots, whether you call them the Occupy movement or simply independent media, whatever you want to call them, we need the American people. We need their opinion. We need their sympathy, and we need their support. Nobody within the Patriot movement is going to do something that will sabotage that public opinion. The government will do that. And I'll give you a good example, and this goes back to the Vietnam War, where the FBI, using their on-campus informants, set up a mass protest outside the Disneyland theme park in Anaheim. And then once that protest was going, the FBI informants who'd organized it just all of a sudden led the protest inside, jumped the turnstiles, and committed acts of vandalism in full view of the press cameras. The next day, it was all on all the newspapers all across the country. Those so-called peace activists were beating up on Mickey Mouse. And then in the 1970s, during the COINTELPRO hearings, it came out that this was organized by the FBI at the request of the Nixon White House to somehow discredit the peace movement so the war could go on. And that's another reason to look at the Boston bombing as a likely government false flag. Because now we're starting to see the agenda to demonize the Patriot movement, to demonize anybody who doesn't agree with private central banking, to demonize anybody who thinks the nation is headed in a very bad direction and would like to see a change in course. So when you see an act of terror that's blamed on this group so that you will hate them and demonize them, it's usually a false flag. Israel carried out all kinds of false flag terror to blame on the Palestinians, so that as Israel took more of the Palestinians' land, the world would say, they deserve it. They're just terrorists over there in Palestine. And then we find out years after the fact that Israel set up the hijacking that led to the raid on Entebbe, so Israel could look great and the Palestinians look bad. Attack on the USS Liberty, done by Israel to make Egypt look bad. That one didn't work out. Lavon affair, bombings in Egypt blamed on the Egyptians. Bombings against British and American assets blamed on the Egyptians. That one also didn't work out. So these kind of false flags happen all the time, and for that very reason, that need for any legitimate group seeking socio-political change, the need for them to have public support, is why pretty much all these so-called terror attacks are false flags, to demonize those who seek positive change in society, to demonize the enemy ahead of a war. 9/11, blame it on the Arab Muslims. Oklahoma City bombing, blame it on the Patriot movement. Boston bombing, now they're starting to blame on the Patriot movement. And again, common sense. Why would anybody in the Patriot movement, other than the FBI informants, carry out any act that is going to destroy public sympathy and support for those sociopolitical objectives? And the answer is, they're not. Okay? So we're going to go to the phones. John in Virginia. Aloha, John. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike.
Hi.
Speaking of who they're going to pin this on, it's a great question. And the other question is who benefits from who they pin it on, and they're switching over to the quote Patriot movement, which are really peace activists use to try and exercise their First Amendment rights. But I just wanted to say, I just want to throw this out there and see what you think. I wonder if they're just waiting for enough time to elapse until they feel comfortable that after they're pleased in the media for the public to turn in all their videos and pictures, that they feel that they've got all this stuff in their hands now, and then they come out with their fake story because they got all the, everybody wants to help. If you read all the stories, every story says, the police want every video and picture they can get their hands on. Turn your camera and stick it. Well, of course. So everybody's going to hand them the stuff once it's in their hands, and they feel like it's all in their hands. Well, now it's time to come up with their fake story and start looking for the 40-something white guys.
Well, if we were still in the age of film cameras, that might be true, but I think all of these people in Boston who are sending in their photos and their videos are simply sending digital copies, and the originals are still on their smartphones and their digital cameras. So I'm not sure what they may be looking for is any compromising images they're going to have to explain away in the official story. Okay? We got to take a break for commercials here. Thank you for the call, John. And for our Justin audience, I got to turn down the volume here for just a couple minutes. And aloha, America, and welcome back to the show. And again, I view it as interesting that unlike 9/11 and USS Cole, we don't have a ready-made villain to present to us, because I think the agenda this time is to say, we must find the Boston bomber, and we have to kick down doors, and we have to examine records, and we can't be bothered with that pesky warrant stuff. It's an emergency. There are more bombers out there, and they may in fact set off more bombs to build a sense of urgency and impetus to where the American people are going to say, oh yes, take away the rest of the Constitution, save us from the mean old bombers, and it is a crock. Now, getting back to Syria, we were talking about how Syria is all of a sudden making gains against the hired mercenary army. And now the United States, this is coming from FARS News, the United States has issued a very strange offer to Syria, in that they are now offering to prevent further war in Syria if Damascus will agree to break all their ties with Iran. And there you start to see part of the agenda to try and break up the Middle East opposition. What the U.S. is basically saying is they will stop funding the hired mercenaries if Assad agrees to basically sever his political relations with Iran, which presumably includes the Mutual Defense Pact. So they're trying to fragment up the Middle East to break it into little tiny, easy-to-conquer pieces. I don't know what Syria is going to do with response to that, but it is very revealing of the true U.S. agenda that they even made that offer. And they're tacitly admitting that hired mercenary army is under U.S. control, because they can't offer to stop the war unless they are controlling the war. Now, down in Venezuela, of course, there's a huge uproar over the very close election by which Maduro, Hugo Chavez's heir, if you will, has won election to complete his 6-year term as president. And the opposition is screaming, vote fraud, vote fraud, vote fraud. They want to recount, they want to recount. The United States is saying, yes, there must be a recount. Again, it looks like they were trying to steal the election. They didn't quite steal it enough, and they're hoping the recount will put them over the top. Barring that, we already know from the opposition, who is backed by the U.S. and backed by the private central banks, that they will kick up a huge civil uproar and try and create the illusion of a popular revolution against the hated evil tyrant Maduro, who's continuing the policy of reasonable wages and salaries for the people of Venezuela, public ownership of public assets, selling Venezuela's oil for currencies other than the dollar, all those evil things which will lead to the victory of the terrorists over the American way of life. So Venezuela very much in play. Now, speaking of Iran, Iran has now arrested several illegal foreign nationals that they caught inside their border with military imaging systems. Now, they're not saying what those imaging systems are, but I would speculate that they go beyond the current night vision and thermographic systems, because we know that terahertz radio technology that is now allowing TSA to look at you naked was first developed for the military for systems to look inside buildings using these ultra-short wave radio waves. And we know this system is out there because somebody inadvertently released a video from one of these systems many years ago. It was presented as a thermographic image during a training drill. But because you could see the studs inside the wall, it was very clear that this was not thermographic. It was also a much higher resolution than thermographic. So it was at that point we began to understand that the latest generation of military imaging systems uses those terahertz radio waves to peek inside buildings, to watch you take your clothes off and do things with your wife and all that other stuff that they are now allowed to do without warrants, because we must find those Boston bombers, blah, 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 blah. Now, information has surfaced, and this was reported over at LibyaAgainstSuperpowerMedia.com, where Tony Blair, following the 9/11 attacks, he was even back then championing an attack on Libya. Got to get rid of that central bank. Got to get rid of that gold dinar. That upstart refusing private central banking. We've got to get rid of him. That's the agenda. Now, a lot of people are still talking about this amazing smashdown of the physical gold and silver prices. Now, it has rebounded today, and we are seeing reports in places like goldcore.com where, as we speculated yesterday, investors and citizens were spooked into selling their physical gold, and the central banks are grabbing it as fast as they can. And the advice I was saying yesterday was, if you have physical gold and silver, I got a wedding ring, and because of that earlier caller, I've got a dime now, that if you have physical gold and silver, hang on to it. It will go back up eventually. And if you refuse to sell your gold and the private central banks can't buy it, then they cannot make good on all that German gold bullion they're supposed to be holding in safekeeping for a hefty fee. And the whole system is going to come crashing down. I think it will anyway. And the next step is going to be mandatory gold confiscation from the American people as soon as they get your guns. Bill Gross and Mark Faber are saying the same thing. In the long term, physical gold and silver is a good investment, is a wealth preserver. Even Kramer, Jim Kramer over there is saying, but now that they've worked to push those prices down, now is the time to buy. And buy physical. Don't buy those paper contracts. They cannot possibly be redeemed. What they'll do is when the contracts come due, they'll do what the Dutch banks are doing. Hey, we don't have the gold. Not to worry. We'll give you this ink and paper stuff plus 10 to 15 to 20% over. So you'll make a bunch of cash. And, of course, that cash will continue to decline in value very, very rapidly. We are hearing reported from all over the place, King World News is one of them, that physical shortages are showing up everywhere. The entire suppression of the gold and silver prices is exclusively by the flooding of these paper contracts into the marketplace. Going to go back to the phones. Aaron in Texas. Aloha. Aaron, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, hey, Mike. I have a quick comment and a quick question. My comment first is I've noticed that you got a lot of colors sometimes talking about.
Okay, your phone connection is garbling. Can you back up and repeat what you said very, very slowly?
Okay, I said, sorry, Mike. Yeah, I've noticed that you get a lot of callers talking about like real conspiracy theories, like numbers and stuff like that appear. And I'd like to I'm trying to explain it more because about what's really going on in the world.
Okay, Aaron, I am really sorry. I cannot understand what you're saying. I'm going to ask you to call back in and see if you can get a cleaner phone line. But I really was having trouble hearing what you had to say, and I apologize for that. Unlike the big corporate media, we're working on consumer-level equipment, and some of it is starting to show its age, and I apologize for that. Now then, getting back to gold and silver. This is over at brotherjohnf.com, where they're pointing out how literally 100 years' worth of silver, based in terms of the production of the world's silver mines, 100 years' worth of silver as paper contracts were dumped onto the market in a single day. This is how the physical metal prices get crushed. Under the laws of supply and demand, it doesn't make any sense that as we hear of physical shortages around the world, the price would go down. It's being gamed. It is being gamed. Over at Project Mind Awake, they're reporting that U.S. silver wholesale suppliers are running out of all physical silver. There's a run on the physical silver. Happened yesterday while the media was all focused on Boston. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. But they're running out of the physical silver. It's all being done as paper contracts, and they can't deliver. Now, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts is out there saying basically the Federal Reserve is very much involved in this attempt to drive down gold and silver prices. And there's a variety of reasons. We obviously understand that for the New York Federal Reserve to reacquire enough physical gold to return Germany's gold bullion to them, and Texas gold bullion to them, they have to buy up as much physical gold as they can, and they want to get it at as low a price as they possibly can, because they're money junkies. And so they're going out to basically find ways to drive the price of gold down, to scare you into selling your gold, and picking it up at a cheap price. That's one of their agendas. Now, what Dr. Paul Craig Roberts is saying is that they're using the crush of gold prices to prop up the perceived value of the U.S. dollar. Because if there is a fall in the U.S. dollar's exchange rate against gold or against any other currencies, it pushes up import prices and inevitably domestic inflation. And the Federal Reserve would lose control over the interest rates. The interest rates would start skyrocketing. That's going to absolutely end this low-cost money with which the stock market is being propped up right now. So, anyway, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts is saying it's all rigged, it's all manipulation. And again, this crush of the gold and silver prices is intended to scare you into running on down to your coin store or those little gold scavenge places. They even have them in the shopping malls. Bring us your old broken gold. We'll give you some paper stuff, and you can run off to the fashion store and get the current fashion colors to wear. So, anyway. Alan Grayson is now officially requesting an investigation into the mechanism by which Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan got the minutes of the Federal Reserve's interest rate setting meeting a day early. It opened up a huge, huge opportunity for insider trading to make overnight millions and millions of dollars by straddling the change in the interest rates. It wasn't supposed to happen. These reports are supposed to be made public all at the same time to level the playing field. And here we have the Federal Reserve accidentally, they're saying it's an accident, releasing this very key critical report to insiders inside the Congress, inside the U.S. government, and J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs. The fraud is right out there in the open. The fraud is out there in the open. Now, we're hearing from over in Europe, this is from the Telegraph in Great Britain, that they're now starting to come to the idea that the Cyprus bailout is the new model. But now they're getting very worried about people taking their money out of the banks, so there's going to be a new change. They're going to go after real hard, unmovable assets. They're going after people's homes now. Sorry, we're going to have to take the equity in your home because we need it more than you do. They're looting the population, and it's right out there in the open. Remember what we said before? The last official act of any government is to loot the nation. And it's going on all over the Eurozone. It's been happening here with the foreclosure fraud, with the runaway inflation that steals real wealth from your pocket after you've earned it. And it's just right out in the open. They're grabbing everything they can to keep their little pyramid scheme going. They're trying to start a world war as a distraction before the majority of the world's people figure out the fraud, figure out what's going on. Over at Refreshing News 99, IRS report shows many of the biggest tax cheaters live in wealthy areas. Well, how do you think they got wealthy? But the IRS has announced they're going to be focusing audits on small businesses this year. They can't be bothered with these big multi-million, multi-billion-dollar corporations who are the biggest cheats of all. No, they're going to go after those small businesses because they don't have the money to fight a legal action for any length of time in court. They're easy pickings to go after those small businesses, forgetting that small businesses in the United States account for 60% of new job creation. But we don't care about new job creation. We just got to grab more of that cash. We got to grab that. Put it in the banks. Keep the banks going just a little bit longer. The one good thing about globalism is that it has brought all of these private central banks to the edge of collapse all at the same time. Earlier on, before globalism, if one private central bank collapsed or was kicked out, the other nations enslaved to the private central banks would immediately invade and force them back onto private central banking. But if they all collapse at the same time, It gives the people of planet Earth the opportunity to restart and say, okay, this is a failed experiment, no more private central banking. No more money as a money-making venture for the banks. We need currency as a public utility being managed to serve the public, to serve the people, to serve the nation, to serve commerce, without a piece of the action being siphoned off for the private central banks. That's the one good thing about globalism. It's all going to come crashing down at the same time. When we start talking about the blueprint for the new America, rule number 1, no private central bank. Rule number 2, no private central bank. Rule number 3, no private central bank. When the Federal Reserve finally comes crashing on down, the first politician to stand up there and talk about reviving that same sick, predatory system, you give them a good, strong coat of tar and feathers, and you run them out of town on a rail. Rough-hewn redwood leaves really nasty splinters. Now, down in Guantanamo, they're trying to deal with the hunger strike that's going on down there with forced feeding. You will stay alive so we can torture you longer. You will stay alive so we can wave you at the American people as the terrorist threat. Anyway, we're coming up here on another break. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Please join us on the air and talk about what's going on in Boston and all these wars and the economy. Meanwhile, earlier today, magnitude 7.8 earthquake in Iran near the Pakistan border. Iran has declared a state of national emergency. That was a big, big wallop. We'll talk about that a little more when we come back from these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about this monster earthquake in Iran earlier today, 7.8. Deaths have been reported because it's in mostly a remote area. They're still getting details out there. Iran has declared a state of national emergency. The number of dead is in the hundreds, and it was a monster quake, and they do get them in that part of the world. Now, speaking of earthquakes and the link between fracking and the sudden increase in minor seismic events all over the Midwest, there's a new dimension to the problems with fracking. Now, for those who don't understand what the word really means, it is a system developed by oil companies to try and extract more oil from wells that have been drilled that are starting to go dry. And what they'll do is they will force fluids down the well pipe. Instead of pumping out, they're pumping in under high pressure, and it's this cocktail of chemicals designed to help dissolve rock and fracture the strata, the oil-bearing strata, so they can suck more oil out. And it sounds like it's a really good idea, but it has been linked to increasing chances of earthquake because they're using this special chemical mixture and not water. The chemicals are contaminating civil water supplies and have already several times. Now there's a new problem because along with releasing more oil from this underground strata, it's also releasing other minerals which can be toxic, including uranium, which is now being shown to contaminate water supplies near fracking operations as well. And the state of Pennsylvania has launched a study to measure how much uranium contamination is coming out of these fracking operations, and maybe that's one of the reasons why Barack Obama just signed an executive order raising the maximum safe exposure to radioisotopes in the drinking water. Some people were saying it's because Fukushima is going to have to dump their radioactive water in the ocean, and it could get here, but now that we're all of a sudden realizing that this oil fracking operation is increasing radioactive contamination of drinking water, that's another reason for the executive order. Hey, go ahead and drink your radioactive water. Believe it or not, when radiation was first being discovered, it was touted as a cure for all kinds of illnesses. You could buy these water jugs that had radioisotopes in them to irradiate the water. And drinking this water that had been exposed to radiation was going to make you healthy and make your hair grow curly and all this other nonsense. And this was all accepted medical practice back then. A reminder that just because it's a doctor doesn't mean they know what they're talking about. They're just there to sell the next product here. Oklahoma is experiencing earthquakes near their fracking zones. Apparently the biggest one was a 4.3 magnitude quake east of Edmond. And 4.3 isn't a big quake for those of us who've lived in Southern California, but for parts of the country that normally don't get quakes, it's a very alarming situation. And remember, the largest recorded quake in the United States was not in California, it was the New Madrid Fault quake. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And interesting little story was just coming in. USA Today is now reporting that instructions from Al-Qaeda on how to make a pressure cooker bomb was published in this supposed online Al-Qaeda magazine called Inspire that was founded by Anwar al-Awlaki, who was an American-born who converted. And it's another false flag, like Adam Gadon and the rest of that bunch. And now they're trying to say, that the instructions to make these pressure cooker bombs are all over America. And they're really pushing this domestic terrorist threat thing as hard as they possibly can. And again, common sense. Any group inside a country that is seeking sociopolitical change does not carry out attacks that will destroy popular support for the change. It just doesn't happen. So, again, another reason to think this is a false flag. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Dan the Man is now in our control room, ready to answer your calls when you call on in. Now, a while back, we were talking about this scandal that was breaking all across Europe, where people were going to restaurants and they were going to their supermarkets to buy products that they were told were 100% beef. And it came out that a lot of these products contain significant portions of other animals, primarily horse. And it's not that horse meat is necessarily bad for you. It's just the idea that if you are paying beef prices, you should be getting beef meat. And one of the meat processing plants that was caught in this scandal has now had to declare bankruptcy because everybody was canceling orders with them. And good, that is exactly what should happen to any company, any corporation that is engaging in fraud against their customers. They should go out of business. Unfortunately, the biggest frauds of all are the financial sectors, and the U.S. government won't do a thing about it. Now, we've been talking about GMO crops and what a disaster they are for everybody except Monsanto. We've been talking about how GMO corn is far less drought resistant than natural varieties, causing additional food shortages. We have been talking about how the various insects and weeds that were supposed to be killed by this Roundup technology have acquired a resistance, evolved a resistance, so these farmers who are stuck with these GMO seeds, they've got all the downside of the GMO technology and none of the upside. They've had to go back to dousing their fields with these other older, highly toxic pesticides to kill off the Roundup-resistant weeds and the insects that have evolved to tolerate the pesticides generated by the GMO corn. And by the way, when you're eating that GMO corn, you are also eating those pesticides. And we're supposed to believe Monsanto when it says, oh, it'll only kill insects, couldn't possibly harm human beings. We know from that French study that rats who were kept for their entire life cycle and fed on GMO corn developed all kinds of serious medical problems. And these medical problems all began to surface just after the time period where Monsanto's own tests basically ended. They tested for 3 months, 90 days, said it's safe, there's no harmful effects. They killed off all the rats, and they said it's safe to use. This French study, and now there's a new Russian study to duplicate that result, showed that the medical problems showed up in month number 4. How very convenient for Monsanto. Now there's a new study showing there are further reasons to be very concerned about consuming GMO corn, that it's more hazardous even than we thought. We'll be right back. America, welcome back to the show here. We're talking about yet another study that has come out that GMO foods, and in particular GMO corn, genetically modified corn, are more hazardous to your health than previously thought. And the core of this problem has to do with something called protein synthesis or gene expression via the proteins, because the DNA, the genes, control the mechanism of the cell in terms of the chemistry. And that's the blueprint for all the chemicals being formed. And one thing that has come out is because DNA is incredibly self-referential. That's how they can fit all of that information to make a human being into that little tiny, tiny molecule. It's constantly referring to other parts of itself. And because of that, when they modify a gene in one part of the DNA of a plant, it will trigger changes to other parts of the organism. And Monsanto and these other genetics companies aren't even looking for those other changes. They are testing to see if they're getting the desired result. The corn is producing insecticide. The mouse glows under ultraviolet light. And they're not looking for other changes elsewhere. And they're completely unpredictable. I'll give you a good example. The farmers who are growing the GMO corn have discovered, much to their chagrin, that the stalks of the corn are much tougher than the natural varieties. They're having to basically buy Kevlar tire tractors because the GMO corn was tearing up the tires on their tractors. And they had to buy these more expensive tires to deal with that. And it's just a reminder that when you tinker with one part of the genome, it can have repercussions throughout the entire organism. And even though cooking food will destroy the DNA itself, the proteins produced by that DNA are still going to be there. And therein lies the danger. So it's a very serious situation. And again, we have a government that turns a blind eye to anything being done by corporations that are making above a certain level of money and who are very generous in their campaign checks to Congress and the White House. Speaking of Congress and the White House, apparently Obama yesterday signed a law that absolutely gutted the reporting requirements regarding insider trading by the United States Congress. Now, technically, insider trading is blanket illegal for everybody. Members of Congress, because they are privy to pending legislations, are in a position to enrich themselves immensely by buying and selling their stocks based on what they know is about to come to the floor for a vote. There was an attempt to pass a law specifically prohibiting insider trading by Congress. That was, of course, voted down. There were reporting requirements that were originally part of the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act. Those have now been rescinded by Obama. So it's open season for corruption. The last official act of any government is to loot the nation. And we're definitely at that point. Now, let's see here. Australia. Let's talk about global warming and climate gate in response to that earlier call, because it is a huge problem. World is getting warmer. It's all your fault. It's all carbon dioxide. And when that fizzles out, they'll try and tax you for nitrogen. Or how much oxygen are you consuming? You must pay a tax on that. That's not a far reach. They're talking about taxing the nation on how much rain falls on your property. They're already doing it in places like Oregon. Those are the king's raindrops, you knave. You will have to pay a tax on it. And somewhere down the road, I'm sure some government money junkie is going to be thinking, well, these American people, they're consuming our planet's precious oxygen. They ought to pay a tax on that. It's not that far a reach given the current lengths they're going through to try and take more money from us. Anyway, down in Australia, they are considering recognizing a new class of refugees where they're going to grant refugee status to people who are fleeing climate change. Now, this is just getting silly. I understand that nations will grant refugee status to people who are victims of oppression and torture in their home country, and they want to get to some place that's going to be a little less abusive. But now Australia is looking at granting refugee status to people who are fleeing their homes because of climate change. They're still out there trying to push this whole global warming nonsense. 10 years ago, they were saying global warming means there'll be no more snow. Now we're coming out of yet another record-setting winter. And they're out there saying global warming creates cold weather. They won't let go. They've got an opportunity to take carbon taxes from you. They don't want to give that up. No matter how silly they sound, no matter how stupid they look, pushing this warming equals colder weather nonsense. They can just taste that extra money coming into the coffers, and they don't want to let go of that. Like a little terrier. It's grabbed onto your ankle, and it doesn't want to let go. Now, over in the world of computers, we've talked about this before. PC sales are plummeting, and a good part of that has to do with Windows 8 being an absolute disaster. Microsoft's idea was they were going to make the big desktops and the laptops look just like the tablets and smartphones, and they aren't, and you don't use them for the same purposes. But they wanted that whole tile-based content delivery system to turn your computer into just another media outlet, not let you do serious work on it. A lot of complaints about Windows 8. We are now hearing that Windows 8.1 is about to be released. And again, it appears Microsoft has not learned from its earlier mistakes. It's going to have the same tile interface, no start bar. None of the things that experienced longtime Microsoft customers wanted are going to be put in there. It's just another excuse to put more disks in the store. You want to buy Windows 8.1, you want to purchase an upgrade. Not necessarily. But basically, according to research firm IDC, Windows 8 is driving buyers away from PCs. They are going more towards smartphones and tablets. And the power users who require a desktop are going over to Macintosh and to Linux. And what's really amazing is way, way back, Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer was out there saying that Windows 8 will be a smashing success. Wrong. And he was just out there saying, you know, I have no doubts it'll be a huge success. You should buy it. And again, this model of forcing everybody to purchase a whole new design from scratch operating system every 5 or 6 years. Maybe you can get away with that in a healthy economy where there's plenty of currency circulating through all levels of society and people have got extra money to spend on this kind of nonsense. But in this economy, you can't do it. People are hanging onto their computers as long as they can. They're hanging onto their cars as long as they can. This business model of planned obsolescence, you will buy a new thing even if you don't need it, that is failing in front of us all. What Microsoft really ought to do to stay in business is they should go back to the last operating system that Microsoft customers really liked and used, XP, which is still considered technically current, but Microsoft is going to cut off support for it next year. They ought to go back to XP and just build on it the way Macintosh does. After they converted to their Linux-based system, they're not doing a complete new operating system every so long. They come out with operating systems that are improvements and have new features, but they're not changing that core. The core is now robust, reliable, and dependable. And what we've seen from Microsoft all these years is each new operating system, because it's a complete redo, redesign, it comes out with problems, lots of problems. And Microsoft users become very frustrated because they've already been through it once with the earlier operating system. We went through it with Vista. We went through it with Millennium Edition. And Microsoft thinks they are so powerful and omnipotent that they can basically get away with saying, we're going to create a whole new pile of junk and you will buy it. And worse, you will have to go out and buy new versions of all your applications because your current applications won't work on the new operating system. And they're so tyrannical in this approach to it that current PCs that have bundling contracts with Microsoft, when you buy the computer at the store, it comes with Microsoft Windows, whatever, pre-installed. They now write the BIOS. That's the hardware basic input-output system. That's the very core code on the CPU board itself that allows the CPU to run. Those are written to prevent people from going back to an earlier version of the Microsoft operating system. Some of them are even written to prevent people from putting Linux on these machines, which is why if you want Linux, you have to do what's called a white box. You have to build your own computer from discrete components, which is generally going to get you a better machine than those all-in-one store-bought machines anyway. But Microsoft, unless they're willing to adjust to the new realities, to the new paradigm and the new economy, they're going to drive themselves out of business because people are just sick and tired of this nonsense. Windows 8.1, another excuse to soak people for an upgrade on an operating system nobody really likes. Now, this is kind of a bizarre one. This story came out of Digital Journal a while back. An Indian study reveals that male bats perform oral sex on female bats. I want to know who signed the funding check on that one. We're going to take a break for commercials. Join us on the air, 800-313-9443, and we will be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to take a phone call here. Nick in Winnipeg. Aloha, Nick. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. How's it going?
Going fine.
Hey, I just got home, so I missed the first part of your show. So I'm not sure if you've gone over the whole Boston thing yet. No doubt you have.
Yes.
Anyway, I'll try and make this quick. Last time I called, I mentioned that before I strategically relocated, I had one time worked for the emergency planning office in East Belfast.
Yes.
I also grew up during the Troubles, so trust me when I say I know what a real, and I would use this term loosely, terrorist attack looks and feels like. Since last night, I've been watching the videos online, and right after the device is detonated, there is a man in the immediate vicinity, like clearly wearing full military spec clothing, light combat khakis, Omega tactical boots, physically well built, with a military haircut, holding an inspector handheld digital radiation alert detector. Like, that's an explosive detector. He's either federal or military. He isn't part of, like a bomb squad tech support. Like, it doesn't make sense. You know, these explosions, I mean, they were clean, but they lacked enough power. Sure, people were killed and injured, but terrorists want massive casualties. 2 fatalities and 25 injured isn't a real attack. Like, I mean, the bomb squad was there before, during, and after. Add to that the other similarly dressed men noticed along the routes and on the rooftops. Like, this was a staged event, and a sloppy one at that. I mean, and we don't really need to stop talking like there's a chance it was anything but a staged event, you know?
No, I agree. I agree with you. And I remember when I saw the video of the actual detonations, and I'm not the only person to comment on this, it didn't seem like they were all that powerful. And
no, not at all.
I know the media is talking about the 3 tragic deaths, and they're talking 180 injured, but most of those 180 were like cuts and scratches, and they're not in the hospital.
Yeah, no, that's why I'm shocked.
Seriously injured people. The total number of seriously injured people is actually very, very small. And so they're trying to parade this as the biggest terrorist attack in the United States since 9/11. But,
really?
You know, yeah, that's what they're trying to say. This is the biggest attack since 9/11, and they're just out there pounding this as hard as they can on the media. But it does seem to me like these bombs really were a fizzle, and it may be that it was poorly made propellant, or those pressure cookers were a little more resilient than the perpetrators put together. But again, when you look at the effects of an average drone strike by Obama, which kills 50 innocent people for every 1 suspect, it's really in terms of the real human cost. And I'm not trying to trivialize or minimize the tragedy for the involved families and those people who have been grievously wounded and the ones who are dead. But in terms of real physical damage, it's not that big an event, but it's certainly being presented that way and pumped that way by the corporate media.
Yes, all over the place, which is the reason I no longer fly. I mean, I had to go to a Broncos game last September and I had to drive 17 hours. I've got to drive through Nebraska and South Dakota, but You know, I don't want myself and my girlfriend, you know, to have a proctology exam just because I want to go see a football game, you know. So, unfortunately, that's how quite a few foreigners are thinking right now, you know. I don't want my children molested to go see Peyton Manning, you know.
Well, it's destroyed our tourism. It's destroyed our tourism here in the United States and especially here in Hawaii. Unfortunately, because Hawaii is a bunch of islands and we don't really have inter-island ferries any longer. If you're going to go to another island, you have to fly. You have to go through TSA. I did that last Saturday. We went to visit family down on the Big Island. Going down from Honolulu to Hilo was actually very pleasant. They had a metal detector and that was it. Coming back, I got the full Nazi treatment. And,
I heard you the other day.
Yeah.
On Friday, I think you were saying.
You know, I mean, these are people, you know, understand this. To get a job as a cashier at McDonald's, you have to have a 4-year college degree now. All you need to go to work for the TSA is a high school diploma or a general education diploma, which means you dropped out of high school, but you took the test, and they said, all right, you know enough to function in society. And these people are, by definition, morons. If they had any kind of intellectual achievement, they wouldn't be working with rubber gloves, touching other people's dirty underwear. And so for them to adopt this attitude of they have all the answers and they know what's going on with these terahertz scanners, you know, it is a given that everybody they're talking to at those security gates is at least as educated and intelligent as they are, if not more. And so that's what makes their attitude of presumed superiority all that much more angering to those of us who actually did go to college and who are educated. And it is. And of course, we're already seeing in the aftermath of this, they're saying we've got to have TSA in the bus stations and we've got to have TSA at the train depots. And they're actually talking about, you know, roadblocks, checkpoints where you will be forced out of your car, go through a naked scanner, put back in your car before you're allowed to drive anywhere else in the country. Peter King is out there screaming, we've got to double the number of security cameras in all of our American cities. It's a huge push for more money to the security industrial complex, and as I mentioned earlier in the show, all of this stuff has failed utterly. Got to take a break for commercials. Nick, thank you for the call, and we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the phone. Steve in Georgia. Aloha, Steve. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mr. Mike. I got a question for you. What is the definition of a terrorist or terrorism?
Freedom fighters aimed back at us.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, you know, if they're pointed at the bad guys, they're freedom fighters, and you know, if they're aimed back at us, they're terrorists.
I was taught that a government that is trying to scare the people, its citizens into submission.
Well, that's another good definition, although I use the word scarerism for that kind of propaganda operation. Yeah, you know, who is it who's working as hard as they can to keep the American people constantly in a state of terror? ABC, CBS, NBC, NPR, Fox News, and the U.S. government.
The SPLC?
Yes, the SPLC.
Yeah, I was just wondering. Yeah, I figured, because you don't see a connection here, do you?
Of course I see a connection. I mean, look at this constant corporate media saturation of this Boston bombing. They haven't reported hardly anything else at all except the fact that the stock market went up again today. This is a sales campaign. They are rubbing the nose of the American people in the bloody sidewalks of Boston to serve an agenda which is starting to emerge. They're selling this whole idea of a domestic terrorist threat. And
that's the way I see it, too.
Yeah.
I think I just wonder what you thought about that definition, because they turn it around like they do everything else, and we got new definitions. They take away the period and add a semicolon or a comma and add something to the end of it, you know?
Well, you know, we've seen that in recent months where they're describing people who support the Constitution as potential terrorists. People who are taping animal rights abuses are being called terrorists now. They're just throwing that label around willy-nilly with wild, reckless abandon.
They're going after American people, man.
They are. The federal government is getting ready to declare war on the 50 states.
Yeah, they're just trying to find an excuse and get enough support. I mean, when Obama said usurper and thief, he said 90% of the people are behind him. He must be reading the wrong news channel.
I think he's listening to his own propaganda and believing it. And as somebody who watched what happened in Hollywood when celebrities started believing their own press releases, it's an invitation to a disaster.
Yeah, well, I thank you for your time, sir.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It is a good question. What is a terrorist? And certainly the definition as espoused by the federal government and by the corporate media has certainly mutated over the last couple of years, where they're starting to call anybody who speaks out against excessive taxation or the violation of the Bill of Rights, they're all being called potential terrorists. And it's not just political smear tactics. Once they say you're a potential terrorist, all of these additional laws under the Patriot Act, and CISPA come into play. We are allowed to go into their bank accounts because they're potential terrorists. We're allowed to loot their computers because they're potential terrorists. We're allowed to scan their emails and listen to their phone calls and track them with that GPS in their cell phone because they're potential terrorists. And it's absurd. But again, that's part of that whole idea of trying to bluff you all into staying silent, not saying anything to your friends and neighbors, either in person or over your social media. And again, what Boston has proved to us all is that all of this surveillance, all of this security industrial complex, the naked scanners, the crotch groping, the looted luggage, the dropped and ruined laptops, the TV cameras on every street corner, the microphones, all of it does not work. Fusion centers don't work. Databases don't work. Scanning Facebook accounts for information, it doesn't really work. They're saving up all of this data, and there is so much of it, they can't correlate a meaningful result. Boston just proved that. So when somebody like Peter King comes on out and says, we've got to throw more money at security and Department of Homeland Security and TSA and TV cameras and the rest of it, you have to stand up and say, what? The system you've got doesn't work. It failed. Why throw more good money after bad? We're going to have to rethink what's going on here. Now, from the point of view of the federal government, obviously, right now, having made so many enemies around the world, they're viewing everybody as a suspect. They're getting a real bunker mentality over there in Washington, D.C., where right now they're looking at 300 million Americans as potential enemies, along with most of the population of the rest of the world. They're trying to find some way they can confiscate firearms. I'm rather amazed they didn't find an automatic machine gun among the bomb debris to try and rope the gun grabbers into this thing. And I'm sure the gun grabbers are going to come in and say, this proves we must have taggants in bulk powder purchases, and we've got to have registration of all purchases of gunpowder. Which, by the way, they already do that for black powder. I don't know why, but when you buy black powder for your muzzle loaders, you got to show your driver's license. Go figure. All righty, so basically coming up to the end of the show, the phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443, and I want to go back and recap the situation coming out of Boston. We know there were 2 bombs. Officially, they're saying there were 2 bombs. The earlier reports of unexploded bombs have now been denied. But we know that something happened over at the JFK Presidential Library, where something happened at the front door, and there's a huge fire, and we've got the photos of the fire damage. Now they're saying, no, completely unrelated. Like, I guess there are so many bombs going off in Boston that it should be seen as just a coincidence. But that's the official story. Only the 2 exploded bombs. They were reportedly built inside pressure cookers, which matches the description from this supposed Al-Qaeda magazine. We know from the aerial view of one of the 2 bomb sites that one of the plate glass windows along those storefronts was blown out, not in. There's a reason to suspect that the bomb may have been physically inside that ground floor building when it exploded, which makes all of this brouhaha about turn in your photos and videos from the marathon an absolutely pointless exercise. The presumption now is that this was another false flag attack. to bring about a political agenda. It's already being used to try and ramrod CISPA through Congress, to possibly accelerate more of the gun-grabbing laws. The Obama administration is trying to portray to the United States Congress that they are now personally in danger from 300 million Americans. They've got to disarm them. They're out there taking guns away from returning veterans on the basis of psychological problems. They're taking guns away from people who are on prescription antidepressants. I can't say that that's necessarily a bad idea, except they're still blaming the guns and not the SSRIs. The real correct way of dealing with this crisis would be to ban the SSRIs, but they make too much money, and the people making money off those SSRIs are writing huge campaign checks and huge advertising contracts. We can't stand up to them. All bow before the money. It's just a little piece of ink and paper, and it's controlling your life. We know the U.S. government is afraid of the American people. We know the Federal Reserve is afraid of the American people. We also know that these money junkies will do anything, including starting a war, to cling to their little scam, to keep that little pyramid scheme going, to keep us all enslaved to debt so that we believe we must do as we are told by the holders of that debt. It's rule by compound interest, and it's no more legitimate a form of governance than rule by divine right or rule by slavery. We're on the verge of a huge transformation of human civilization, where we look at the bankers and say, you are not the government. You are supposed to serve the public, not run the world. And yet we clearly see that is their agenda. They want a global reserve currency that we will all be permanently enslaved to. So getting back to the situation in Boston, the fingers are pointing. Everybody with an agenda to follow, an axe to grind. They're pointing fingers at right-wing, ultra-Christian conservatives. They're pointing at leftists. They're pointing at the Patriot movement. That's quickly becoming the main focus of the corporate media. Gosh darn those people. The Patriot movement, we've got to keep an eye on them. Their fingers were being pointed at Saudi Arabia. Jane Harman was out there screaming it had to be Muslim terrorists. Everybody's out there riding this incident for whatever it's worth to serve their own particular agenda. Nobody's really interested in the truth. Nobody's really interested in the facts. That's just not part of the process anymore. I am paid to sell this to the American people. How can I use this tragedy to sell this to the American people and make more money for myself? That's what it means to be an insider in the corporate media or in the political structure. You're there as a salesman to sell an agenda to the American people. And everybody's waving these bloody shirts as hard as they can. And I think there is so much saturation on the corporate media, they're probably going to burn this out very quickly because, again, 3 dead is unfortunate, but it doesn't have the emotional impact of thousands being dead. I think these bombs were intended to kill a lot more, and they fizzled. Will this go away? I don't think so. This government can't back down any longer, and so I would not be at all surprised to see additional bombings in the coming days to try and make this look like this is a national threat from coast to coast to coast, from the Canadian border to the Mexican border, from the Atlantic Ocean to that other one out there in the west. To try and make it look like it's a national emergency to justify draconian steps by the administration. And again, I view the fact that we don't have a ready-made villain du jour to wave at the American people, like a Lee Oswald or an Osama bin Laden, as suggesting that this Boston bombing is going to be used to basically suspend more of the Constitution in that need to go out there and find the perpetrators of these horrid, horrid bombings. So this may be the beginning of a huge, huge operation to scare the American people into surrendering what's left of their civil rights under the Constitution. Don't fall for it, please. We know what happens when you surrender your civil protections. We saw that in Germany with the Enabling Acts. And by the way, a little reminder, how Hitler got those Enabling Acts is his own people, the brown shirts, went out and caused the acts of terror that Hitler used to get his extraordinary emergency powers as Chancellor of Germany. It's a good trick, and it worked back in 1930s. They're hoping it'll work again. They're hoping that you are dumb enough to fall for the same lies and the same tricks over and over and over again. Fool me once, so forth and so on. And it all comes back down to that idea of the bankers' wars. When you have a private central bank issuing the public currency as a loan at interest, that currency is not a public utility. It is a money-making venture for those private bankers who have been granted a license to counterfeit by the federal government. And one more reminder for those of you who are, like me, a supporter of the Constitution of the United States of America. Those of you who, like me, are actually living that vow, that oath of office the President takes. I do solemnly swear to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. We're living those words right now. Under that Constitution, the U.S. government is vested with the authority to coin money and regulate its value, and cannot transfer that authority to a privately owned central bank absent a new constitutional amendment. The Federal Reserve Act is unconstitutional. Congress sold you out for 30 pieces of silver. The modern Congress continues to sell you out for 30 pieces of silver. Congress could at any time rescind the charter of the Federal Reserve, but they won't do it, because Wall Street and the Federal Reserve are much more generous with members of Congress than you can afford to be. All righty, let's see. Callers on the line. Alex in Texas. Aloha, Alex. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. I'm calling because I'd like to ask you a question in regards to the Kennecott mine incident that happened last week before the paper pushers took down the price of gold and silver.
Yes.
And I was wondering if, for some reason, they might have done that to and kept it out of the news to hopefully for them, hoping that Capriles would win in Venezuela, and that it would justify the velocity of money into the system through inflation of the commodities.
Well, I don't, first of all, let me step back here. I don't think what happened at the Kennecott mine was intentional. I think it was an industrial accident, and the normal result should have been, because of a reduction in available perceived supply versus the demand, it should have driven the prices up. And I think the reason it was pretty much kept out of the corporate television news media was so that people wouldn't scratch their head and ask, why aren't these physical prices going up? So I think that was what's going on with why that was being de-emphasized in the corporate media. I don't think it has a real connection with Venezuela, because the primary focus of Venezuela is their oil. And yes, they do have other mineral resources, but the primary focus down there is the oil and making sure it's available for sale only for the U.S. dollar.
That's exactly my point. What I was figuring is perhaps that the money that's sold out of gold would then transfer over to the petrodollar or U.S. Treasury bonds as a for lack of a better term, safe haven. What I think was happening was that because I've been looking at the commodities lately, and it just seems like all the money would go into a specific area, would be driven into a specific area, kind of like how you said yesterday, like a rogue move to confiscate your gold without them actually confiscating it, or making you know what I mean? So
yes.
that the velocity of money could be justified in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I understand what you're saying. I don't see how that would link into what's going on in Venezuela. The rush is on by the central banks to grab as much physical gold as they can because of the gold runs that are already happening in the banks of Europe. But I don't see a really significant link between that mechanism and the revival of the petrodollar by way of Venezuela. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And over at silverdoctors.com, they have an interesting take on the crush down of gold and silver prices. As we mentioned before, some of the exchanges in Europe have already defaulted on their gold delivery contracts, and they're having to settle for cash, and it's costing them a premium. And the take that we are seeing from silverdoctors.com, they are predicting that the American COMEX, the Commodities Metal Exchange, will also default on their silver and gold delivery contracts in the coming weeks. And this idea of flooding more of these paper contracts, which cannot be delivered onto the market, to drive the prices down is so that when COMEX settles the contracts for cash, they can do it for a lot less money. And of course, the paper contracts will then completely crash and bottom out. COMEX will settle those for pennies on the dollar. COMEX will come out with their cash intact. And of course, everybody who bought these paper contracts is going to be up the creek without a paddle. One more call before the end of the show. Alex in New York. Aloha, Alex. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. I don't want to take you off topic. I just wanted to comment on the Boston bombing.
Yes.
I just wanted to point out such an obvious false flag. So too obvious. I mean, at a marathon, come on. It's almost like out of a Hollywood script.
Yes.
And another thing is, I think the government, they wanted to pull back on, I guess they figured, let's not do so much carnage this time around as opposed to 9/11. Let's just give a little shock and awe presentation. So let's, instead of putting the bombs under the bleachers where the crowds of people were, let's do it across the street where, you know, a minuscule of people, a handful of people, or sadly, you know, eight-year-old boy was killed. But what does the government care? You know, our lives are expendable. But, you know, that's the only comment I want. It's just such an obvious false flag.
Well, it absolutely is. Yeah. I mean, if somebody, you know, if it was an anti-tax protester, they'd go after the IRS buildings. If it was somebody from the Middle East, they'd go after something critical to the government or to Wall Street. Yeah, the only reason they picked the Boston Marathon at the finish line is because all of the media's cameras were going to be there. They were going to get maximum publicity, maximum coverage. It's very obviously a public relations campaign.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sorry to take you off topic, Mike, but that's all I got today.
No problem here, and it is the main topic here. And again, I want to stay focused on what they're going to use it for. I'm less interested in, you know, who the guy on the roof was or all this other little side issues. I want to stay focused on what is the government going to use this terrible, terrible action for? What agenda are they going to be pushing? And it looks like what's evolving is, oh, it's domestic terrorists, it's the Patriot, it's Occupy. We've got to have more surveillance. We've got to suspend the Constitution so we can go out and find the perpetrators of the Boston bombing. And again, I think the intention was for far more people to be killed, and they didn't get that. They needed a lot of blood for that shock value. I would not be surprised to see additional bombings carried out all over the country to make it look like it's an immediate threat everywhere in the country to try and scare the American people into surrendering what's left of their Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The federal government and the Federal Reserve are desperate, desperate, desperate. They're feeling cornered, and cornered, desperate animals are at their most dangerous. So, there's the music. Time for us to get out of here. Thank you for sharing time with us today. Please spread the word about Republic Broadcasting and what really happened. We need to start reaching those people who aren't plugged in yet to what's really going on in this country. I need your help to do that. You're all Rivero's Rangers. You need to go out there and just start sharing what you know with who you know. And we'll be back here tomorrow. Aloha, America.